Good morning. Good morning. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Good morning. Welcome to Montreal. We decided that in honor of all of those who've come from afar, that we would switch the weather from being balmy and warm up until last night to give you a little bit more of a traditional Montreal welcome. Which we have to say this winter, this sort of weather has been quite unusual, as I understand it has been in most other places. My name is Tim Evans. I'm the Executive Director of the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, and I'm delighted to have everybody here with us today to talk about serosurveillance and working together to try and move that forward in a concerted way, not only in Canada, but globally. I want to just begin with a little bit of a housekeeping note, which is we are offering simultaneous translation throughout the meeting. And I think virtually all of our interaction will be in English, but we do have francophones participating. And pour les francophones avec nous, nous avons le plaisir d'offrir de la traduction simultanée. La réunion se fera en anglais. Donc, pour ceux et celles dans la salle qui voudraient écouter en français, présentez-vous à l'arrière de la salle aux tables techniques et notre équipe vous donnera des écouteurs. Pour ceux et celles en ligne, dans le panneau de contrôle situé en bas de votre écran Zoom, cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation pour choisir le français. Okay, so those are just some instructions for people who are online that if they want to listen in French. We will be recording this meeting. I hope people are comfortable with that. We didn't send a notice out in advance, but we just think that it's important for those unable to attend or who would like to understand what we talked about, that there's access to this. If any presenters or moderators would prefer their sessions not to be shown publicly, please send a note to Caroline Faneuf, or Prativa, who's sitting beside Caroline. And then we will have a 10 to 15 second break this morning between 10:51:45 and 10:52. No, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the first scientific strategy session, and that will allow people to get a little bit of necessary blood sugar boost, as well as take care of all things natural. With that, I would like to begin by simply, it's an intimate enough group that I thought it'd be great if we could just do a quick round of introductions, because a lot of people have come from afar, and I think it would just help break the ice a little bit if people could just stand up and say who you are and where you're coming from. And that would just help, I think, encourage that we make sure that we understand the diversity, the great diversity that we have today. So I'm going to start on this table right here.
Okay, I'll do it again. My name is Hannah. I work at the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force on the data management team, and I'm from Montreal, and I did my bachelor's in immunology and my master's in analytics management. Nice meeting everyone.
Hi everyone, my name is Ahmed. I work with Hannah on the data management team. I actually have a master's in engineering, so it's a different field, but I love public health, and nice to meet you all.
Good morning, all. My name is Bill Moss. I'm from the International Vaccine Access Center at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Good morning, I'm Andrea Carslan, and I'm also at the International Vaccine Access Center at Johns Hopkins.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm finishing my PhD from Princeton University, working on mathematical modeling of infectious diseases and serological data.
Hi, I'm Agatha Jassam. I'm a clinical microbiologist at the BC Center for Disease Control Public Health Lab, overseeing a lot of the viral diagnostics and surveillance.
Hi all, I'm Ina Sekirov, also from the BCCDC Public Health Lab, a medical microbiologist, mostly dealing with TB, but also having a very soft spot for serosurveillance.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Morshed. Everybody call me Morshed, by the way. And I'm from Vancouver again with these colleagues from BC Center for Disease Control, and I'm a clinical microbiologist working on zoonotic and emerging pathogens and somehow involved in COVID-19.
Hello, my name is Itlali. I'm also from BCCDC, and I'm a research project leader working with Ina, Agatha, and Morshed.
I'm Amanda Lang. I'm a clinical microbiologist at the Roy Romano Provincial Lab from Saskatchewan, mostly dealing with molecular and serology for viruses and zoonoses.
Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Steen. I'm from Chatham Provincial Lab in Manitoba, and I work in the serology and parasitology department there.
Good morning, I'm Marc-André Langlois. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa and the executive director of the Coronavirus Variants Rapid Response Network.
Hi, everybody. I'm Caroline Fedeff. I'm a communications and marketing consultant, and I oversee communications and knowledge translation at the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force. And if you have any issues these days, I'm one of the people you can come see. Hi.
Hello, everybody. Prativa Baral. You all know me. I've been sending you all of the emails. Really nice to see you in person. I'm Prativa Baral. I'm supporting Tim in the development of HumanNet.
Hi, I'm Tanya Murphy. I'm the data manager at the CITF. And so if you want data, come and see me.
Hi, I'm Steve Drees. I'm the lead microbiologist at Canadian Blood Services. I'm also a professor in lab med pathology at the University of Alberta. I brought the weather.
Good morning. I'm Philip Awadala from University of Toronto and the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, and I'm the National Scientific Director for CanPath.
Hi, everyone. I am Sheila O'Brien from Canadian Blood Services. I'm the Associate Director of Epidemiology and Surveillance.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christian Renaud. I'm a medical microbiologist in pediatric infectious disease, and I'm a medical director at EMA Quebec.
Hello, everyone. I'm Allison Spalding. I'm team lead for the PREMIS program. We are a pandemic preparedness program at the NIH Vaccine Research Center in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Ray Sagener from the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. I'm a retired infectious disease doc, co-director of ethics for CoVarNet.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Angela Crawley. I'm a PhD scientist in immunology of liver disease at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and I'm director of the CoVarNet Biobank. Graduate of McGill, too.
Hi, I'm Monica. I'm coming from Germany, from the Helmholtz Center of Infectious Disease Research, Department of Epidemiology, and we did some method development, multiplex immunoassays, and I co-led the large German SARS-CoV-2 seroprevalence study.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Perl-Monero. I'm a research assistant who's been helping lead the HumanNet project. So I've seen a lot of you virtually, and it's very exciting to see all of your faces in person. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Manasa Koropali. I'm also a research assistant supporting all the great work that Tim, Varun, and Prativa are doing here with HumanNet. And it's great being back in Montreal after graduating with my master's in public health.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Hankins, Kate with a C, in case you're wondering. I'm a professor at McGill in the Population and Global Health School that Tim leads, and I'm the former co-chair of the task force.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mairead. It's pronounced like parade, but with an M. This won't be the first time you'll hear me say that. I'm from University of Calgary. I co-lead the SeroTracker project alongside Harriet, and lovely to see you all. I work in infectious disease epi.
Hi, good morning. Very nice to be here with all of you. I'm really looking forward to the meeting. I am Ligia Pinto. I am the director of the Vaccine, Immunity, and Cancer Department at the Frederick National Lab, National Cancer Institute. I come from Maryland, US, and I'm an immunologist by training, and I am the scientific lead for the Serological Sciences Network. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thomas Janisch from the Center for Global Health at the Colorado School of Public Health.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Olivia Oxlade. I'm one of the Associate Scientific Directors of the CITF. I oversee management and operations.
I'm Jonathan Campbell, Assistant Professor at McGill. Largely do tuberculosis work, but dabble in COVID from time to time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Varun Anupindi, Senior Research Advisor at the CITF and helping develop HemaNet with Tim and Prativa. Nice to see you.
Great. So thank you, everybody, for those brief and excellent introductions. We do have a few number of people who've joined us online, and we're just going to flash so that you get a sense of the millions that are out there. And we can see your names, but Lori, Ryan, Carmen, Olav, Liana, welcome. And we look forward, some of you may be able to get here, but we hope that you'll be able to continue to join. Apologies for the weather, Lori. We send all bad weather to the east now, but welcome and look forward to your participation. Okay. So we're going to get going, and I'm just going to begin with a little bit of sort of a historical perspective on essentially why we're here today, and then what we hope to achieve over the next 3 days. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement, which is, I think, always important, recognizing that we are meeting today on lands that have been and continue to be the lands of indigenous people, including in this area the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg nations, and important for us to acknowledge that most of us are guests, settlers on this land, and we need to respect traditions, legacy, with respect to indigenous people here and everywhere. I want to now say, I'll just provide a few sort of overview reflections of the trajectory of the last 4 years. I don't think anybody back in February or March 2020 would have predicted, could have predicted the trajectory of the pandemic. Maybe Donald Trump figured it out, but in reality, I think no one had any sense that there would be as many waves, that there'd be as much, as I'd call the curveballs of new variants, the rate at which vaccines emerged, and all sorts of other issues related to the response. So I think it's incumbent upon us to try and reflect on that experience as we seem to be exiting, and I say that cautiously, because JN.1 has shown us that there's still quite a lot going on with respect to SARS-CoV-2. However, some reflections on the past. We're really interested in making sure and learning from the past that we move towards a more sustainable serosurveillance capacity in Canada. And I think that doesn't suggest that CITF has the answer. No, we need to think about how we engage as we, the CITF, finish its mandate with others who can make sure that the next time we have a pandemic, we don't have to start from scratch again. And then I'll finish by just briefly looking at the objectives for the meeting. So you have to be careful about what you write. David Naylor and I wrote an op-ed back in March of 2020, and it was with with a little bit of hubris. We said a path back to normalcy, how Canada needs to respond to the pandemic. And I think implicit in that headline was that we were pretty sure that within 6 months we'd have this thing licked. But one of the things we said was really important was to have a capacity to track immunity. And we made the statement that we didn't have a pan-Canadian capacity to track immunity. And so that led to a phone call from PHAC saying, well, why don't you do something about it? And so Trudeau announced the COVID Immunity Task Force about a month later and said, go to it. And then it was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So it was really a rush. And some of us who were part of that may remember that it was literally like a new startup, because we had to find sources for specimens as quickly as possible. And so you had to say, okay, well, where is it? Where do we draw on things to get insights on what's happening in terms of immune status? So we had 3 sources that we thought, which first, residual bloods. Said those bloods are out there. The blood services, Quebec, Canadian Blood Services. We have antenatal surveillance, where residual bloods are put aside as part of first trimester testing, and those could be tapped. And then, of course, provincial labs are always up and going. So we said, okay, how can we perhaps get them mobilized? The second is we said, well, there are lots of cohorts that are up and running all the time in Canada. And 3 of them in particular, the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, CAMPATH, which is represented here by Philip Adewala, and the child cohort were up and running well before. And we thought, well, they're in the field. They can help us. And then the third is we said, well, maybe we should also go to national household surveys. And StatCan is the primary group in Canada that does national household surveys. And then another effort out of University of Toronto, led by Prabhat Jha, was Action to Beat COVID, in which he used an Angus Reid sample to get to households. But so that ended up being sort of the mechanisms that we resorted to, and it was this patchwork because we didn't have an existing push-button system. We could say, this is what we need to do. We needed to get reliable measures of immunity. And in May of 2020, we still had no approved immunoassays. And so, well, if we got the blood, what are you going to test it with? There are a bunch of what I call homebrewed immunoassays starting to emerge, but we didn't have any reference panels in the country to test those assays. And I remember conversations with the National Microbiology Laboratory saying, where are you getting your blood to assemble those reference panels? And there was no system. Well, we have some angels, some blood angels, who send us blood on a regular basis. Well, great for those angels. But if the angels don't send the blood, you don't get that, the necessary numbers and the types of bloods that you need to assemble a great reference panel. You needed to think about having assays not simply for those who could get their blood drawn, but also perhaps for testing at home, which raised the whole issue of, if you're going to do surveys, you're going to need a mechanism of getting finger prick bloods, and we didn't have a DBS system or dry blood spot system at that time. Once we had assays, we had to figure out, well, how do they interact with one another so that we compare results coming from different sources. So we set up cross-validation studies. And then once you got large volumes coming in, you needed to have a capacity to analyze those. So the platforms for analyzing, which meant procuring new equipment, getting it set up, staffing it, standardizing it, and making sure it was operating effectively. And then required, when you're sending samples across the country, transportation and storage of those samples, right? So all of that had to be done quickly. And it got done, but it was not because there was a standard operating procedure across any of those things. It was on the fly, and people were burning, the midnight candle, getting things moving. So it wasn't a lack of effort, but systematically on this front, we were not terribly well prepared. And then we had to think of, okay, well, if we get our specimens and we've got our dependent variable, our measure of immunity, what are we correlating it with? And this raised issues about, well, what are the range of socio-demographic correlates that we want? Because those who collect blood regularly or have sources of residual blood don't necessarily have access to a large range of socio-demographic correlates. And the task force tried to say, well, not all socio-demographic correlates are measured the same across sites, and so we need to standardize those, and so we created a core data elements as guidance to ensure that we would have some comparability across those independent variables. And then the whole issue of record linkages, which is if you had a unique identifier for individuals, was it possible to get access to medical records where you could find out all sorts of things that would illuminate risk in ways that a very limited set of socio-demographic variables might not? And this raised all sorts of issues which in the data culture of Canada were not easy to negotiate, even in the context of the emergency. And if I can call out heroic efforts by Canadian Blood Services, for example, over the last 2 years, they've negotiated a settlement, or not settlement, through lawyers, a record linkage opportunity with ICES in Ontario. But that took over 2 years to negotiate. And now that's given us a massive opportunity. But just to say, these things that make so much sense and allow you to get insights on what's going on require a system that allows these things to come together. And most of what we've spent our time in the task force doing over the last 4 years is trying to bring those things together in the absence of a system that was set up to do these things at the start. So this then led to, once you get the infrastructure ready, you have to implement it. And this is another dimension that, again, was illuminating because it takes time. You have to do due diligence, as you all know. You have to have proposals, you have to review, you have to have a transparent and accountable decision-making. And then you have to go into the nitty-gritty of making funding arrangements between the government, in this case, and different institutions. And then once the money arrives in institutions, all of you who are there know you've got REBs, consents, material transfer agreements, data collection issues, sample analysis. And then once you've got all the data in, you get into analysis, preprints, and publications, right? So that whole system is another area where it can move, and it does move, but whether it moves at the speed that's necessary in the context of emergency is not a given. So then we got data from individual studies, and it was the opportunity of putting them together. And this required data sharing agreements. And David Buckridge, who will join us, but who's not here, but Tanya, who is here, and the team on data management will know that those data sharing agreements require a lot of bureaucracy and time. And to negotiate those across 120 different studies is not easy, especially studies that were set up 15 years ago and had their own infrastructure on data sharing with a lot of bells and whistles and checks and balances to make sure that that data is being used appropriately. So it wasn't as if it was de novo that we're engaging on data sharing agreements. We were working with these in major and difficult ways. However, then we went into global synthesis because it wasn't just the Canadian big picture that we're interested. We're interested like, well, how's Canada doing relative to others? So we set up something called SeroTracker in May of 2022, and the criteria for setting up SeroTracker is that those involved were not allowed to be over the age of 25. And what was amazing with that criteria, SeroTracker was set up faster than anything else that I can remember. But they started synthesizing sero studies that emerged around the world and putting them into a dashboard and giving us a sense of, well, is Canada an outlier? Are we the same as elsewhere? What's going on elsewhere? And so that was very important. And then the third area of the big picture is modeling. Because when you get the results in, you realize that there's shortfalls on all sorts of things and that you need to estimate parameters that would give you a better sense of how to make sense of the big picture. So all of that to say, it allowed us to get to early August, late July of 2020, and this is what we saw, the first results emerging out of the blood banks, HQ and CBS, and we saw about 1% seroprevalence after the first wave. And I have to say that was disappointing, because so many of us were sure it was going to be like 20, 25%, that there was massive asymptomatic transmission, that we were on our way to herd immunity. And we weren't. So huge wake-up call, because 1% meant, oh my God, we got 99% of the population who are just waiting for that next wave, right? So we were just into it at that point. We were able to look at the vaccine rollout. And because of the vaccines focused exclusively on the anti-S protein, we could use anti-S antibodies to look at that trajectory. And so we could monitor that with the data, in part because infection rates were so low. Had infection rates been 30, 40% of the population, charting this curve would have been much, much more difficult. So it allowed us, the trajectory, serendipitously, to be able to have a good look at this in terms of the vaccine rollout in Canada. And then during the Omicron wave, which some people think as more as a tsunami, because in essence, some of us way back in March 2020 anticipated that this is what the first wave would have looked like, and we were dead wrong. But this is what happened, as we all know, which is that with the increased transmissibility and the immune evasion, this variant basically infected 25 million people during the year of 2022 in Canada. And if you said that you had an equal number of infections every day, which we didn't, it was about 70,000 new infections a day. Now, the peak of infections in the first wave was somewhere around 10,000 a day. So this was, in a sense, almost a completely different epidemic in terms of the magnitude and things, and very importantly, introduced, coming on the heels of vaccination, this whole area of hybrid immunity. And we've been able to, now looking at repeat donors, to get some sense of the trajectory of the combination of both infection-acquired immunity and vaccine-induced immunity by looking again at the anti-S, anti-N patterns. And these are just two individuals with self-reported vaccine status. But you can see that in the first, on the left side, you have somebody who didn't report being vaccinated but had a relatively high anti-S IgG. But you can see they had two infections with sharp rises in anti-N, and that boosted the anti-S. Okay, but very importantly, you also see patterns of waning in those antibody titers after those infections or after those vaccinations. And so we think that this, again, looking at repeat donors over time, allows us insights on this combination of what we call hybrid immunity, and then may also help us to understand what the trajectories are for boosting in different combinations of infection and vaccination and in different age groups. So just to say that that's evolving work. When we look at what we drew on over now 4 years, almost 4 years, we did millions of serologic tests. Now, we're lucky at one level because when we sold this to the government in April of 2020, we said that over 2 years, we will do 1 million serologic tests. And each test will cost $30, and therefore we need 30 million or 300 million, or we had some calculus to get to a budget. Over 4 years, we looked at 1.3 million samples. 1.1 million of those were from residual blood sources, primarily our blood services, and about 200,000 were from studies, either cohorts, household surveys that we set up. So that gives you a sense of proportion. And then if you look at where those blood samples came from, 1 million were from blood donation services, 40,000 from provincial labs, 25,000 from antenatal surveillance, and 7,300 from pediatric samples. Now, this is indicative. These are not exact figures, but they are give you a sense of the ease of access, number one. Number two, the antenatal samples is not an indication of the availability, but the difficulty in accessing those across our 13 different jurisdictions that are responsible for antenatal surveillance in Canada. Very, very tough. Deb Mooney from UBC will tell us the challenges she encountered in trying to align antenatal surveillance opportunities across those 13 jurisdictions. And on the pediatric samples, thanks to Carolyn Quach and a wonderful network called Popcorn, and which is 14 pediatric hospitals across the country, which they set up in 2022, and an even better network called Kernels for the Popcorn Network, which was looking at residual bloods in the hospitals of pediatric patients and looking at testing those samples for immunity. So that came late in the game, and therefore it's not necessarily a fair comparison, but it's indicative of some of the challenges of getting life course representation when you're relying on residual bloods as your source. So we had our first in-person meeting, and only at that point, the only in-person meeting. This is the second in-person meeting of the task force in 2023, March 7th, 8th, 9th. And on the first day of that meeting, or the day before the meeting started, we got a group together a little bit like this and said, can we draw on the experience to develop a sustainable serosurveillance capacity in Canada? And so that brought a little bit of brainstorming. We started to move forward. Little did we know, at exactly the same time in Washington, D.C., there was a serosurveillance summit. And we're delighted to have representatives from that summit here today, but they were looking at, again, in parallel, in a very similar way, with a slightly larger global view, to look at experience and challenges in setting up serosurveillance systems. And they had a set of working groups and produced a very nice report, which I would recommend to anyone, and we'll hear a little bit more of their work during this meeting. But I mention it because I think it's always encouraging when you identify other folks that are moving on the same path and doing great thinking, because it gives you a stronger sense of the sorts of things that we need to rally around. So it's obvious to this group, but I think it's really important that we are clear about why serosurveillance adds to overall public health surveillance. And I say that because the area of overall public health surveillance is crowded, and it has difficulty finding space to accommodate all the different needs of surveillance. And I think if you're not clear on the value added, then sometimes those other priorities, which could be based on a disease or could be based on acute testing or wastewater surveillance or other types of surveillance, might push serosurveillance to the margins. And so these sorts of things, the ability to look and find transmission patterns that are below the surface. We often use an iceberg analogy. The temporal assessments, you can biobank bloods and you can go back and look back in time, but also you can project, and we'll hear a little bit about the modeling going on. Opportunity to look at coverage of vaccine preventable diseases, hugely important. UK, demonstrated this in the 1990s, looking at measles, and my goodness, look at what's happening with measles globally, right? It's coming back up, and in part because we are not looking at the extent to which we're slipping below herd immunity in many constituencies. So another great opportunity. And last is that there's dimensions of serosurveillance that are just incredibly cost effective. All the bloods that come in, they're sitting there. And so the question is, if you look at that, and we've looked at that, we think there are about 5,000 bloods a day that are drawn in Canada that end up in a residual pool. That's a lot of biomaterial that's just sitting there. And so if you say that's a resource to be tapped, surely one can think about ways of looking at some of those bloods to get some sense of what's going on. So clearly, as you all know, there are health threats beyond SARS-CoV-2, and these are some of them. Just vector-borne, emerging diseases, and then, as I said, the vaccine-preventable diseases. And then there's a future. And I think we're trying to get a sense of that today or during these next 3 days with folks who are involved in some of those exciting frontiers. But it's that the possibility that we may move beyond infectious threats and look at chronic disease or even environmental hazards. The whole multiplex era is upon us, and this is not necessarily new, but it's fast emerging, and I think the opportunities on that front are exciting. And then there's a whole area of precision public health that is emerging with precision immunology, novel biomarkers, and then new ways of bringing sero data into understanding with big data and AI. So those are some of the exciting frontiers. And so The question we have is really, is it possible to harness the current and prospective value of serosurveillance through some form of networking? And that's led us to do a little bit of work around something we call HEMANET, in which we're trying to create a sustainable pan-Canadian serosurveillance network for peacetime and emergencies. And we think if we have a network that's operating every day, that when we do have that call and that emergency, then we'll be able to draw on that network to move to pan-Canadian assessments within 2 weeks, as opposed to 3 to 4 months. And I think that sort of public health intelligence is critical. But some of the functions that we think are really important is really just the seroepidemiology, that it has a real value in terms of pandemic preparedness, that these platforms or networks could actually be resources for the development and discovery of diagnostics and therapies, so they can have a research utility, especially if they're marketed in that way, and opportunities for national and international collaboration. We set up a number of working groups, and we'll hear back from those working groups over the course of the meeting, including the first one in the next section. But we thought very important to have some sense of what the scientific strategy is. Beyond SARS-CoV-2, what would be the next pathogen we'd focus on, or next set of pathogens? We think, I have a background in the dismal sciences, that's economics, and some others in the room share that weakness. And we thought very important to look at value for money. This was something that came up in Vancouver in March. But why is it good value for money to do this serosurveillance? And can we get this into the area of cost effectiveness, which would allow us to then make a case on relative importance of serosurveillance? Whole set of issues on data protocols, standardization, and sharing, and those are things that require work in peacetime. Consents, permissions, and privacy, extremely important, especially if we're going to move into data linkage and data sharing. And then partnerships, not only across the country, but also internationally, recognizing that there's a lot of great work going on. And then finally, governance, which is, we don't want to create a super bureaucracy. We don't want to replace PHAC. How do we have something that is value added without being so heavy that it weighs us down? So these are some of the challenges that we've encountered. First is strategic sampling and biobanking. If there are, about 5,000 residual blood samples per day that are collected, right, and that are there, what's the best way to take advantage of those? Clearly, you don't want to test all 5,000, right? And clearly, it's got to be a function of, well, what are we trying to look at, and what do we need? So, to me, there's a lot of work that needs to be done and say, okay, if that's the pool, and this is how it's distributed over the life course, how can we be more systematic in thinking about tapping that in a smart way? Huge issues of representativeness. The red on the top of the map there are the Canadian territories, where we had a lot of difficulties getting any insights on what was going on. One exception in Northwest Territories, thanks to Cami Condola and working with Canadian Blood Services, but otherwise very difficult. But also children, very tough. Remote areas, people living on reserve, Indigenous peoples. There are issues that we need to think about in terms of coverage and representativeness. And we'll have a session on that, which I think is really exciting in terms of thinking about how to address those issues. Laboratory quality and standardization has been an issue. Marc-André Langlois knows this better than anyone else, but he was part of a high throughput capacity that we created along with our University of Toronto colleagues, and And that was sobering in many respects because I think it raised some of the issues that one has to pay attention to in understanding how to make sure that we've got comparable data across laboratory settings. I think that great opportunity to learn from that. Record linkage to serological data. I mentioned the agreement between ICES and the Canadian Blood Services, but we have another agreement that's been in the works for over 2 years now. I'm looking at one table up here at the front, and we still haven't got the lawyers to agree on that. And we're hoping that if we got 2 Canadian provinces that had record linkages, that might help a domino effect, right? And so there's lots of work that needs to be done on that front, data sharing and more. So those are some of the challenges that we need to think. Infrastructure enhancement, data management integration, analytics and modeling, human resources, huge issue. And I just want to mention this because part of the networking, and we have representatives from universities here, is not simply to do the analytics and the research and the modeling, but it's to do the training, right? There are very few courses that are offered on seroepidemiology. And there's not a lot of training to help what's needed in a seroepi system across different dimensions. And those are areas where public health schools, like the one I'm running and others are involved in, could perhaps be much more proactive in supporting the pipeline of people in an environment where we know human resources are a relatively scarce commodity. Partnership opportunities, these are some of the partners that are working actively with us now and trying to sort of shape this network opportunity. These are sort of more on the national front. Again, this isn't a closed network. It's an opportunity, but you can see that we come from different types of institutions. And I think the opportunity of doing things across these different types of institutions and initiatives is important to seize. And then, of course, and we've got great representation here during this meeting, international partnerships, where there's great work going on in very similar ways, but also in ways that are quite unique, which we need to learn about and continue to share. So that's a little bit the experience. I think that's where we're at, and therefore we've drawn people to this meeting today and tomorrow and Friday to really talk about the opportunity of networking. And we will look today, well, the objectives is really to assess the current and prospective state of science for serosurveillance, and then look at how we can develop network functions that allow us to be strategic and operational. We'll look at the scientific strategy today. We'll look at tomorrow frontiers of serosurveillance, and on day 3, we'll be looking at what a national serosurveillance platform might look like. So that's really what you've signed up for, and we're really looking forward to your participation. Let me thank you all in advance for availing yourself for a few days on this collective thinking. And with that, I'm going to stop. We have a few minutes. There may be some questions or comments people have before we move to the next panel. And just welcome to a few other people who've come in the last few minutes. Okay. Questions, comments, things that I might have, you felt like, when is Tim going to say this, or he was dead wrong, or I disagree, or there's a huge issue that we should put on the table? Floor is open. Philip, please.
Thanks, Tim. That was a fantastic overview and a very clear description of the outline for going forward. This is going to sound like a really naive question, but I think you have the expertise. So how are we going to define success in the context of value added? Is it purely, particularly in peacetime as well as in wartime? I'm thinking about it to some extent like a cancer screening sort of strategy. Like there are 2 different ways we could think about success in terms of value added there. You could think about taking some people out of the population because you've improved, say, biomarker development and they're not being, you're saving some costs there in terms of screening, or you could just have a better biomarker and you're removing all those people at risk. So that's how I'm thinking about that kind of value add. I'm not sure how to think about it here.
Yeah, so I don't have a quick or easy answer to that, but I think the question is essential, and it's a great starting question. In this next panel, we're going to be focusing on use cases. So one thought is, well, there are some low-hanging fruits, to use a bad analogy, but there's some next pathogens that we could focus on where there's huge value. So one of the ones we've been talking about is perhaps orthopox viruses. Okay, Mpox is like, ooh, what's going on there, right? And are we seeing something which is going to, as the cohorts, who haven't been vaccinated following the elimination of smallpox in 1979, do we have more population susceptibility that we need to be sensitive to, and should we be doing some vigilance on that front, building on perhaps the early warning signal we've had with Mpox, right? So one is to look at some pathogens that I think could be helpful. A second would be, there are ways of doing this where we can have much greater value for money, right? Which is, we can look at a half a dozen things. And there's already been some good work on this that we can think about in terms of vaccine preventable diseases and multiplex assays, which are looking at coverage, not just of a single disease of concern, but perhaps the childhood cohort of antigens that we want to make sure we've got good coverage on, or others. And I think the third area that I am particularly interested in, which is perhaps a little bit more on the science front, is if we could expand into chronic disease surveillance, perhaps in the area of cancers, and we have biomarkers that are good indications of susceptibility or early risk and things like that, then I think that would, take us into a new era on this front. So those are a few thoughts, but I'm only putting those out to encourage people to think along those lines, Philip, because I think the more thoughts we have on where we can get real value, the more wind we'll put into the sails of this network in terms of trying to say, how do we harness that value? Thanks. Marc-André.
Yes, thanks, Tim, for that very nice overview. So this is a question normally one would ask on the last day of a meeting, but I want to ask in the first day, because I think it's important to keep this in mind in how HEMANET will steer its strategic objectives. The Public Health Agency of Canada will say it is part of their mandate to do surveillance and serosurveillance. How does HEMANET fit into that? And how can HEMANET deliver value added to that mandate? As a network of also academics, should we also be thinking of how to more closely align research initiatives, training initiatives into this network to ensure that whatever HEMANET is doing in regards to serosurveillance, it maintains that, that overview or that spirit of research and training?
Great question, Marc-André. You must have been reading my emails. First of all, just a couple of quick responses. When I worked at the World Health Organization, I would often ask the question, who is who? And that's not just because Mel Lastman, the mayor of Toronto, during the first SARS outbreak, when WHO announced travel sanctions on travel limitations on Toronto, Mel Lastman got very upset and said, who is who? He didn't know what the WHO was. But more importantly, the World Health Organization is not limited to those who work in the Secretariat in Geneva. And the Public Health Agency of Canada is not limited to those who work in the bureaucracy
in Ottawa. It is our public health agency. And I think that's really important because it's a shared responsibility for public health that I think we need to develop. And there's just no way in hell that the Public Health Agency of Canada will ever have the internal capacity it needs to have a command and control surveillance system on its own. It has 64 different surveillance activities going on, and it has a terrible challenge trying to manage those sustainably and at a level of performance. So I think the idea is to work with the leadership of PIAC and say, this is collaboration around public health in the 21st century, where we all have a responsibility and ability to contribute. They have an incredibly important role, but so does academia, so do our public health laboratories, so do our blood services, so do all sorts of other partners in this. That's what's going to allow us to be operational. On the training issue, I think there's a huge role that academia needs to step up to. And I run a school of public health, population global health, but I don't think we're doing enough on this front, is my view. And so if I look across our Masters in Public Health program, seroepidemiology, I'm not sure, I don't even think it's a mention. We have some graduates here and they're shaking their head. No, they had, and that's a problem, right? But there may be other ways as well. We've got some folks who are doing some really good modeling work and thinking about representativeness. We've got people who are looking at value added and bringing an economics lens to that. So I think there are ways that we can be part of adding value on this front, which we need to be much more explicit about. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions here, and then we'll move on to our next panel. Yeah, please.
This is perhaps a big question, but Tim, how do you answer naysayers who say that blood donors are not representative of the Canadian population?
Yeah, so we do, first of all, thanks, great question, because there's a lot of that. And we were fully expecting that was going to be a problem until we had our data from SeroTracker. Okay, SeroTracker, those who are 25, under the age of 25, and doing the synthesis of global sero studies, they showed us results. And they looked at studies that were looking at seroprevalence from blood donors versus national household sample surveys. And there was not a significant difference in the sero estimates that came out of those studies. So there was, yes, there are issues of representation, not to suggest that they're exactly like the whole population, but the national household sample surveys didn't reveal statistically significantly different results than those surveys that were based on blood donors. So that's one. But 2, as we'll have a session here, there are all sorts of really important ways in which we can begin to accommodate some of the shortfalls in representation through modeling, right? And we'll have a whole session on that. I think on day 3, Alton here is leading that. So it's not to suggest we don't have issues of representation. It's just that sources of residual blood, like blood donors, shouldn't be excluded because we're worried about representation.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, and remind me of what we went through with SeroNet in the beginning of the pandemic. So very nice. So I have one question and one comment. So how do you envisage the involvement of the technology industry, as well as involvement of policy and regulatory bodies? Because I think that's going to be really important to make a change. I haven't seen serology yet going to the level of recommendations that I would love to, like for boosting, but I think that this type of infrastructures can provide data that can inform really public health decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple of things. On the technology front, we've had some great discussions with companies that are developing immunoassays or diagnostics, and they're really interested. right? And I know we've had experience, some of the laboratories here have been working with some of those companies. So I see that as an opportunity. And as I said, in one of the functions we say is I think the network could be a resource if we manage it properly for those that are interested in the development of diagnostics and therapeutics, immunotherapeutics especially. But that's something that where we need to be strategic and clear and be open to having those discussions and managing them appropriately. On the policy front, yeah, it's really important just in terms of standards and accreditation. I'm thinking, we were back and forth with the National Microbiology Laboratory in Canada because we needed them to put those panels together so that they could look at the reliability of assays and set some standards for, their performance. You have to have those, right? We didn't have guidelines on how to get those developed quickly. And so I think we can be a catalyst to getting some of those functions more secured in agencies whose responsibility it is to provide that normative guidance. We're going to hear from WHO tomorrow, Maria Van Kerkhove, who's been a leader in serosurveillance for a long time. But she, I think, is very interested in also saying, well, what can WHO do in its normative sense in helping to set guidelines, right? Which then once we have agreement that, in fact, those are great guidelines, then we don't have to recreate them in every jurisdiction, right? Or we can adopt and adapt them to fit our context rather than creating something de novo. So I think those are some of the areas on the policy front where we can be things. The last thing I'd say on that is very important is that I think we need to look more explicitly at policy for surveillance. And because serosurveillance is just one part of a bigger strategy and approach to surveillance. And I think my experience is that it's done in a very piecemeal way in an ad hoc way most of the time, just because you respond to this or that as it arises. And we're not thinking about a systematic approach to surveillance which allows us to say, this makes sure that we've got all the pieces functioning and in such a way that we're doing what needs to be done for the public's health.